Also, the other thing that we got coming up is if you like wildflowers, we have a variety of bluebonnet that gets about 3 foot tall and they're already starting to come out. So February, March would be a great time to come see the giant bluebonnets out at the Big Bend. So anyway, right now I'd like to go ahead and read Nick's little cheat sheet here. On Tuesday of this week, news broke about the release of 130,000 pages of U.S. government UFO-related documents that were previously classified as top secret. Nobody in the world knows more about government UFO documents than our next speaker, Nick Poe. While working in the Ministry of Defense, Nick was in charge of the British's top secret X-Files. His highly classified work is included in alien abductions, crop circles, government psychic experiments. Nick has been called the real Fox Mulder. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Mr. Nick Poe.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. I would like to thank, first of all, everyone who has worked so hard to organize and indeed support this conference. So thank you to Noe, to Ruben, Brad, Donna, the Del Rio Chamber of Commerce, staff here at the Pulpogue Theatre, and absolutely anyone else who I've forgotten to thank. But I know there's a huge amount of work that goes into this, so thanks everyone. I worked for the British government for 21 years, but I'm a good guy really. As Brad said in the introduction, okay, if anyone else shoots at me, I'm not going to go on. As Brad said in the introduction, this has been quite a week for anyone interested in UFOs. I think we're all too used sometimes to this subject either being ignored by the mainstream media, or when it is picked up, getting kind of ridiculed by the mainstream media. And yet, here's a week where this story has been on ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, you name it. This story has been right across the mainstream media. And I think what this shows is that there is a kind of mismatch here. People are genuinely interested in this subject, but on occasion, it's kind of like the media hasn't got it. Well, I think this week has been something of a wake-up call, and it's also been a wake-up call for a whole generation of journalists who've been brought up to believe the kind of soundbite that they've been told, and when they've asked about this, which was, oh no, this subject isn't really of any interest. Yeah, we had a small unit program called Project Blue Book that looked at this subject years ago, but they didn't find anything, and it was very small, and you know, we didn't really take it seriously. Well, if that's true, there wouldn't be 130,000 pages of documents on it. So I think this week, you know, some of the reporting of this story has not been entirely accurate. I mean, a lot of this material has been out there for a while, but it's not been easy to find. It's not been in one place. It's not been in a single searchable archive. This week has been a good week for this subject, and I think you know, it's a base that people will go and build from. So I just wanted to mention that. What I'm going to do in this talk is really discuss my own direct experience of the British government's UFO project, and that's something that dates back to 1950, when the British government's chief scientific advisor at the Ministry of Defense, the great radar scientist Sir Henry Tizard, said that reports of UFOs should not be dismissed without first undertaking some sort of proper scientific investigation. So, this being government, once he'd made that pronouncement, the Ministry of Defense did what any bureaucracy usually does in this situation. They set up a committee to look at it. And in the history of the British government, and certainly in the history of the Ministry of Defense, I think this committee was probably the most splendidly named committee in the history of the civil service. It was called the Flying Saucer Working Party. And they were convened in 1950 and they reported in 1951. And their final report was very skeptical, and they said most UFOs are just misidentifications, hoaxes or delusions, and we recommend no further action. But the very next year, the Royal Air Force got dragged into a wave of sightings, and these things were being seen by the military. They were being tracked on radar. Our own military pilots were getting scrambled to go up and try and intercept these things. So the Ministry of Defense was dragged reluctantly back into the subject. Now, I joined the Ministry of Defense in 1985, and the policy was that they moved you around every few years. And it so happened that in late 1990 and early 91, I had been seconded into the Air Force Operations Room in the Joint Operations Center. And we were basically a briefing cell in the build-up to the first Gulf War. And I was working to a particular manager there. And he said, "Oh, Nick, I know that you're due for a move. And after this crisis is over, you will be looking for a permanent posting to another part of the department. But I've liked the work that you've done here, and I have a job to offer you. Will you come and work for me?" And I said, "Sure, what's the job?" And he said, "It's UFOs." And I kind of did a double take, and I thought he'd said, I don't know, I thought, what, ultra high frequency? Is this some sort of technical radar job or something? He said, no, UFOs, flying saucers, you know. We've had a small project that looked into this for many years, and I'd like you to take that over. And I looked, and I dug out the Ministry of Defense phone book, and it was itself a classified document because it had fairly detailed job descriptions of thousands and thousands of people that worked in headquarters. And sure enough, there was one little page, and it just said UFOs, and that's all it said. So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. And that's what I did for 3 years of what turned out to be a 21-year government career. But from 1991 to 1994, I ran the British government's UFO project. And what I'm going to do is dip into those real-life X-Files. And excuse me, I'm not doing a PowerPoint presentation because everyone else does PowerPoint much better than I do. And so I'm not going to compete with people like Jim Mars, who are real experts and have some really fantastic slides. And mine would just be kind of very small print Ministry of Defense documents. So I'm just going to talk to you, if you'll excuse me for that. So I'm going to kind of just hopefully give you a flavor of what it was like working in that section. And Brad said that I had been called by the British media the real-life Fox Mulder, and well, that's very flattering, and it's true, they did call me that, but the job was not exactly like the X-Files, sad to say. There was no gun. I worked in an office, and I tended to avoid darkened hangars and torches and all that sort of stuff. And sadly, I was not issued with an Agent Scully to accompany me on any of this either. So, you know, if they call me the real-life Fox Mulder, I think I should sue under the Trade Descriptions Act or something. I should have asked for my Scully, I guess. Anyway, so we got about 200 or 300 UFO reports each year, and what we did, like I say, was not run around with torches and guns, but we first interviewed the witness and got all the details of what they had seen, you know, where, when, what did it look like, what sounds were associated with it, how did it move, what height was it at, speed, did you get a photo, all those sorts of things. We would then try to correlate what we had received with things that we knew about or things we could find out about. So we would speak to, you know, we would check civilian flight paths and military ranges and danger areas and bombing ranges and things like that. And we would see if we could find any aircraft activity that would tie in with what was seen. We would liaise with meteorologists to talk about weather phenomenon, to talk about the launch of weather balloons. We would we would liaise, excuse me, we would liaise with astronomers to see if there were any bright stars and planets, fireballs, meteorites, satellites, re-entries into the Earth's atmosphere of burnt up rockets or satellites, all those sorts of things, airships. And we would go through the whole list, and at the end of that, 80% of the sightings we could explain. 15%, there was really not enough information to make a definitive assessment, and 5% of cases were genuinely unknown. What was a typical day like? It could be anything. It could be a phone call from a member of the public telling me about a UFO sighting, or it could be a phone call from the commanding officer of an Air Force base telling me about a sighting that he or some of the people in the command had. Could be a child doing a school project on UFOs, writing in and asking for information. It could be a journalist saying they're going to put this on the front page of the paper. Could we give them a line to set out the government position? There was no typical day, and you didn't know whether when the phone rang or when the military signals arrived, you were going to get an obvious weather balloon launch, or whether you were going to get the next Roswell. You just never knew. And sometimes, of course, people were pretty excited about this, and our project wasn't secret. I mean, in a sense, it couldn't be. It needed to be open for people to report, because the vast majority of our data came from public sightings. And you know, sometimes people would get pretty carried away, and I remember one of my first calls was from someone who was nearly hysterical, talking about a bright white light that they'd seen. And I tried to get some further details, and they said, well, it was very strange because on either side of this bright white light there was a red light and then there was a green light, and they were kind of flashing, and this whole thing was getting lower and lower in the sky. And I asked where this had happened, and they said, well, I've just moved to London to a place near Heathrow. On another occasion, I received a call from somebody who was actually on their lunch break, or rather they were looking out during their lunch break from an office building, and they were looking into one of the London parks, and they said they had seen a strange diamond-shaped object which seemed to be hovering maybe about 100 feet above the ground. And he said, it's really strange. And then he became more and more agitated as he was telling me this story, and his voice got more frantic, and he said, I think it's descending. He said, it's coming down. He said, there are, you know, people are pointing, and then his voice kind of stopped, and he said, well, I don't think it's a kite or anything. I mean, it couldn't be something like that. No. And then he said, it's coming down again. And he said, it's down on the ground, people gathering around. And then he said, oh, they're putting it back in its box. It was a kite. Sorry. So, you know, we had some kind of crazy people. But then, one day, I got into work and the phone rang, and it was a police officer telling me about a sighting that he'd had of a large triangular-shaped craft. He said this thing was just, you know, really slow and silent, huge, you know, the size of a jet plane, but really, really slow, and with 3 lights in each corner of the triangle, and maybe a dimmer light on the center. He said, you know, imagine a flat triangle, like a slice of pizza or something. He said, this is what this thing looked like. And so I thought that sounded like an interesting sighting, and particularly as the witness was a police officer, I thought that was you know, potentially an impressive case. I put the phone down, the phone rang again, and it was another police officer. At first I thought it was the same guy, you know, telling me something he'd forgotten, but it turned out to be another police officer, but in a similar part of the country. And he said he was on night patrol, and he saw this same thing. And throughout the course of the day, more and more reports came in, many of them from police, some from military personnel, and some from the public. And it was clear that we had a major wave of sightings on our hands. And one of the reports came from an Air Force base called Cosford in the Midlands in the UK. And a patrol of Air Force police saw a UFO pass directly over the base. And they kind of made an official report. As they were investigating that, they were aware from the local civil police that something really strange was going on in the surrounding countryside. People were reporting UFOs. One family of 4 were so intrigued by this that they leapt into their car and chased this thing for several miles as it passed low over the rooftops. Sadly, of course, before the days when just everyone, you know, had a cell phone that might have gotten photos or videos of this, but these people chased this thing. They said they thought it was so low that it had landed in a field. When they pulled up the car and leapt out, expecting to see a landed spacecraft, you know, the size of a football field, there was absolutely nothing there. And the guy said to me, where did it go? You know, how could something that big, that low, look as if it was going to come down in the field? I was just seconds behind, and when I got there was nothing to be seen. Well, from another part of the country that same night came a similar story, but this time from a retired couple who were out walking, and they were passing a farmer's field, and they had seen the UFO hovering over the farmer's field. Again, same description, huge triangular-shaped craft, almost completely silent, just hanging there menacingly in the sky. When they got to the field, there was no UFO to be seen, but the farmer was a dairy farmer, and all the cows had congregated in the direct center of the field and we're all standing in a complete circle facing each other. You know, so again, what had spooked the cows, and why were they just standing where the UFO had apparently been hovering over them? Sometimes this job really was like the X-Files. And then I got a call from another Air Force officer, and this is all the same night. All these sightings occurred, and there were several dozen of them in the end that we received. But we knew from the media and from monitoring of UFO groups that there was several hundred sightings in all, just in a period of 6 hours on that one night, late on the 30th and in the early hours of the 31st of March 1993. The meteorological officer at RAF Shawbury, another Air Force base, said that he was on duty at about 2:30 in the morning. The whole base was pretty much locked down. There were only a skeleton staff of duty officers actually up and about. He got up and stretched his legs and walked up, and out of the window of his office he saw a bright light, and he thought, well, that's strange, no one's flying, what's going on? So he walked out, and again this light was huge, and it got bigger and bigger, and eventually he saw that this thing was a craft. And when I asked him to estimate just how big this thing was, he said, well, midway in size between a C-130 transport aircraft and a Boeing 747. So we're talking something pretty big. And yet this thing was almost completely silent. He said he heard a low-frequency humming sound coming from this thing. And he said to me, he said, Nick, I can't really describe this to you in any other way except to say that I felt this sound as well as heard it. And it was kind of like standing too close to a bass speaker at a rock concert or something. He said, painful, really disconcerting, waves of sound going through his body. And he said this thing was maybe 200 feet above the ground, and traveling really slowly, maybe 40 or 50 miles an hour. Well, I don't know how many of you have seen at air shows something like the old Royal Air Force Harrier jump jet that just hovers. The immense amount of power and noise to keep an aircraft like that hanging in the air. And yet, apart from this low-frequency humming sound, there was nothing, and this thing was going really slow, like I say, 40, 50 miles an hour is what he reported. And then suddenly, he said from that slow speed, the thing just shot away to the horizon in an instant. And I asked him to estimate the speed, and he said, I can't. He said, I see military helicopters, fast jets, ground attack, air-to-air fighters. He said, I see those sorts of things every day. He said, I've served 8 years in the Air Force. I've never seen anything like that before in my life. Years later, I found out more and more. Many other people had seen this thing and hadn't reported it because of the fear of ridicule. One of them was a military cadet who actually went on to join the army. He was about 15 at the time, and he was coming back from military cadets. He said when he heard a very faint noise, he said at first he thought it was a motorcycle in the distance, and he looked around and couldn't see anything, and then he kind of just did this double take, and he looked up, and he said one by one, he said it was like the stars were going out. And he thought, well, that's really strange, until he realized that the stars weren't going out, but there was something hanging really low in the sky, so huge that one by one it caused the stars to blank out from his perspective. And again, he was just looking up in awe at this thing. And I had another person who said, you know, at one point he said, this thing got so low that I felt, with hindsight, if I'd have picked up a rock, I might have come pretty close to hitting this thing. And, you know, the reports like that kept on coming. And when you kind of, and by the way, the Ministry of Defense's official line on UFOs, which I dutifully had to give out to the public and the media, was very kind of patronizing downplaying of this subject. And we used to say to people, we examine these reports. We didn't even like to say investigate. We examine these reports briefly to see if there's evidence of any threat to the defense of the UK, but to date, no incident reported to the Ministry of Defence has judged to have been of any defence significance. And then we went on to explain that to the inexperienced observer, ordinary objects can sometimes, when viewed from unusual angles, appear a little disconcerting, and that most of these things were probably little more than misidentifications of aircraft lights and weather balloons. I think if I had tried to explain to that Air Force officer, you know, that he'd probably just misidentified the lights on an aircraft, he might have punched me. Needless to say, I did not suggest to him that his sighting was of no defense significance. But it was, you know, we were in a difficult situation. Of course, we ran all the usual checks. On this one, we decided we'd better ask the American government, our great friends and allies, who share freely all information with us Brits.
Our Americans.
So we went to the, I asked somebody at the British Embassy in Washington, would you kindly ask our American friends whether they have some secret prototype spy plane or drone that they've forgotten to tell us about and might be inadvertently flying over the United Kingdom without having told us. And the Americans came back and said, no, we don't have anything like that. But there was an interesting postscript to the story because firstly, some people in British intelligence, I know this is going to sound scary, but didn't believe the Americans and were indiscreet enough to write a document which said, well, you know, despite the denials, it wouldn't surprise us if such a spy plane or drone exist somewhere. Maybe you're just asking the wrong people. You know how compartmentalized these things get. So this got back to Donald Rice, who was, I think, then Secretary of the Air Force. And the phrase that I heard about his reaction to this British suggestion was that he was, quote, incandescent with rage, unquote, at the suggestion that he had misled Congress on this. So this is the small story of how the very low-key UFO project in the Ministry of Defence in the UK nearly caused a diplomatic incident between the British and the Americans, and nearly undid, you know, 100 years plus of peaceful and mutual cooperation and information sharing in the world of defense and security and intelligence. And what was the one thing that we nearly ended up at blows over? UFOs. The other interesting postscript to that story was that the Americans, after having said to us, no, we don't, we don't have some huge triangular craft that can hang in the air effortlessly and then accelerate away at Mach 10 or whatever the best estimates turned out to be. We don't have anything like that. But then they paused and they said, but would you mind checking whether maybe the Royal Air Force has something like that? That, we're just kind of interested and we'd just like to know. Well, the reason that was so interesting, of course, is that clearly the assumption was that those sorts of things had been reported over the continental United States. Hence, America asking us Brits, hey, have you got something that's 10 times better and faster than us? And we said we wish we did, but we don't. But why that's doubly interesting, I think, is that, of course, the official line, if any of you ever ask the American government what you do on UFOs, the answer is, we are not interested in the subject. We've been out of the game since 1969, when Project Blue Book was terminated. Well, if that's true, why were they asking us about UFOs in 1993? Oops. So something doesn't quite add up. Sometimes, by the way, we did a few naughty little things, like the best way to get around this sort of thing is, there are several ways. Firstly, you can change the language. This is, I feel a bit guilty because I used to do this sort of stuff, but it's all out in the open now. Everything's forgiven, hopefully. One thing we did was we changed the wording. So people would say to us, could you send us some information on UFOs? And we would send stuff. But we also had something called UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. What were UAPs? They were the really interesting UFO sightings, but the ones that we kind of put secret UK eyes only on the files. Pilots sometimes reported these things not as UFOs, because it's the kiss of death to the career, but as, quote, unusual aircraft, or unconventional helicopters, or, if it's a radar operator, uncorrelated targets. So you'll find all these kind of code phrases for UFOs. It's almost like don't ask, don't tell or something, but with aliens. The other thing that this does, of course, is it makes things like congressional oversight and scrutiny and journalistic efforts using freedom of information more difficult. Because you can say, no, we don't have any UFO files. And if you don't ask for UAP files, or files on pilots who've seen unconventional helicopters and unusual aircraft, so there's a lot of information out there that is maybe hidden, but in plain sight. So these sightings over the UK, I just give that as an example of the more interesting sightings that we had in our real-life X-Files. There was one final, we never, of course, managed to explain all of this. This was literally an unknown in the files. Before I closed the case, there was something in the back of my mind, and I thought I've missed something here. Something was bothering me, and then I realized what it was. It was the date of these sightings itself. Late on the 30th and in the early hours of 31st of March 1993. And then I went back and I checked, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with a wave of sightings that took place over Belgium in 1990 that actually involved UFOs being tracked on NATO and Belgian National Air Force radar systems, and they actually scrambled 2 F-16s. And the pilots then got a lock-on, or in fact several lock-ons, with their airborne radars. And a game of cat and mouse played itself out in the skies over Belgium. When I double-checked the date in 1990 that this had taken place, sure enough, it was the exact same night of the year, late on the 30th and in the early hours of the 31st of March. Was it coincidence that 2 major waves of sightings involving these vast triangular-shaped craft that seem to be able to run rings around the modern air forces in terms of the radar and in terms of the fighter interceptors operated by Belgium and the United Kingdom? You know, was it coincidence that these 2 spectacular waves of sightings occurred on exactly the same night of the year, but 3 nights apart? I don't know. But whatever it is, whatever it meant, it was like someone was sending a message. It was almost as if some intelligence was toying with us. For those of you who are interested not just in UFOs, but in the paranormal, you may well have heard the phrase the trickster, the trickster nature of some of these phenomena. It's as if something or someone is toying with us and you know, just playing along, dropping us little clues, and we follow the breadcrumbs, and just as we think we're getting somewhere, the trail goes cold, and then, you know, things happen. These things happen in the occult, the paranormal. I mean, you know, I'm getting off topic, but there's a debate to be had about where UFOs fits in all of this. Are UFOs part of the paranormal? Well, some people say yes, others say no. I mean, those people that take a literal nuts and bolts interpretation of the UFO phenomenon, that it's maybe extraterrestrials coming from A to B, well, those people say, what's paranormal about that? You know, we've sent spacecraft, you know, to the moon and to Mars. It's not paranormal, it's very impressive. And if there was primitive life on Mars and they saw the Viking landers and things, they'd probably be pretty spooked. But it's not paranormal. But, one particular UFO researcher in the UK always got very annoyed at UFO books being put in the paranormal and New Age section in bookstores. And I said, well, where would you put them? And he said, transport. So there's a debate to be had about all of this. Just picking out some more cases at random. One of the particular sorts of cases that, of course, gave us particular cause for concern was the near misses between UFOs and commercial aircraft, and indeed military aircraft. And although we tried not to ever be too dismissive about public sightings, when the witnesses were police officers, pilots, and military personnel, we probably put a little bit more resources into the investigation, because we felt that these people, particularly the pilots, were better witnesses because they were better used to seeing meteorological and astronomical phenomena and had a better idea and were less likely to misidentify something that maybe the average member of the public wouldn't see that often. So, you know, we had several such cases in our files. We had one case from a pilot who said, we were flying along and a UFO came very close, almost directly head on. I had time to shout to my, you know, my first officer and one of the stewardesses who were in the cockpit, "Look out, look out!" And everyone braced themselves for collision, but the UFO rapidly passed down one side of the airplane and obviously didn't hit. And the pilot wrote a very reasoned report of this, which found its way to the UFO project, and he said, I try and rationalize this and think of what it could be, and I think there may be three options. UFOs, whatever that may be, space debris burning up in the atmosphere, and third option, the Royal Air Force accidentally fired off a missile. And then he finished up by saying, if that option C is correct, we are most displeased. And I thought it was typical British and pilot understatement. We are most displeased at the thought that someone might be accidentally firing air-to-air missiles at us. Again, I think sometimes us Brits had a kind of dry sense of humor with this. One time we did an intelligence study into UFOs. Colleagues in scientific and technical intelligence said, look, we investigate all these sightings over the years, but we never do any trend analysis to look for patterns. Let's see what we've got here. And there was a kind of really interesting speculative document right at the beginning, and it was it said something like, if any of these sightings truly represent craft from elsewhere, in the apparent absence of any hostile intent, it seems to us, and bear in mind this is a military intelligence document that at the time was classified secret UK eyes only. And it said in black and white, it seems to us in the absence of hostile, overt hostile action, there are three potential possibilities. Number one, military reconnaissance. Number two, scientific study. And number three, tourism. And that, as you can imagine, somebody putting that in a highly classified intelligence document, in all seriousness, caused a huge amount of scandal when it went up the chain of command. But actually, it turns out that the answer was quite a good one, because I've been to a couple of Royal Society discussion meetings about this, and one thing that is we can make very few assumptions about UFOs, what they are, what they want, but one assumption that we can make with a degree of confidence, high degree of confidence, is that if intelligent extraterrestrials visit the Earth, their technology is orders of magnitude above and beyond our own, because thus far we've sent people, to the moon and unmanned probes to the edge of the solar system. But given that the nearest star is just over 4 light years away, we have not come anywhere close. So clearly, any civilization that has developed viable interstellar travel does have technology way ahead of our own. And in those circumstances, it is most unlikely that we are going to have anything to teach such a civilization about science and technology and engineering. Therefore, it is likely that if Earth is being visited by intelligent extraterrestrials, the things about us that they will be interested in are those more abstract anthropological things. Our political structures, our religions, our philosophies, our architecture, our painting, our poetry, and yes, the Grand Canyon and all the great tourist sites that there are. So, you know, people say, what's a good place to see a UFO? Well, you know, maybe they're as interested in all the wonderful things that we've got here as anyone else. So check out the pyramids, check out the Grand Canyon. So actually, although that line about tourism looked funny, it was actually rooted in some quite serious and logical thinking about what we might be dealing with. A lot of people ask, is there a UFO cover-up? Well, I'm surprised that anyone would think that their governments weren't being truthful with them. How could you think that? Is there a cover-up in the United... I can't speak. I worked for the British government for 21 years. I am now an honoured guest in your country. Actually, I emigrated and moved to the States 3 years ago. And I love it here, so thank you for having me. But people ask, is there a cover-up back in the United Kingdom? And to the best of my knowledge, there is not a cover-up of a spaceship in a hangar smoking gun. If they have such a thing, they didn't tell me. Now, maybe that's quite logical that they wouldn't tell me. But I was on the UFO project, and I think I should have had a right to know, but had a reasonably high security clearance too. You know, one of those, I could tell you, but I'm going to have to kill you kind of ones. There may not be a cover-up, but since I left, there have been some disturbing, you know, hints, perhaps, that not all the information came out. A few years ago, Britain finally got its Freedom of Information Act. We were many years behind you, actually. Ours came fully into force, actually only in January 2005. And when all government departments reviewed what people were asking about, the Ministry of Defence was expecting that they were going to get a lot of questions from journalists and from the public about Iraq, as you call it over here. Potato, potato. And Afghanistan. But when they started drawing up the tables, it turned out, what do you think the #1 subject that people asked the Ministry of Defence about under the Freedom of Information Act was? UFOs is correct. It's the right answer. And so many people were asking, and so much work was being generated, that they decided that they would have to declassify and release these files. And they released this material, and for many years, of course, they had said, we glance at these reports, we don't really have much on this. Guess how many individual documents on UFOs the Ministry of Defence had? Multiple choice: 60, 600, or 6,000? Who thinks 6,000? Yeah, that would be the. It's actually, I cheated. I didn't give you the fourth option. The real answer is 60,000. So again, not bad for a subject on which the government apparently has hardly any interest. And yet, oh, by the way, here's 60,000 documents that we found on this subject that we have no interest in. Oh, and by the way, some of them have secret UK eyes only classifications. But yeah, it's probably just because it's a really, really highly classified aircraft light. A former chief of the defense staff took an interest in this, and he had heard about a case where hundreds of Navy personnel in a big NATO exercise had encountered a UFO whilst on the British warship HMS Manchester. And apparently this thing had been tracked on radar. It had been seen by Navy personnel on British ships, on Norwegian ships. And the former chief of the defense staff, a 5-star military officer, this is the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And this retired military officer, Admiral of the Fleet, the Lord Hill Norton, asked one of the defense ministers for the ship's log for the period when this UFO encounter had taken place. And the answer that the Under-Secretary of State at the Ministry of Defense gave back to this 5-star military officer, who was a firm believer in UFOs, was, my lord, we have located the ship's log for the period before this encounter, and we have located the ship's log for the period after this encounter. Regrettably, however, the ship's log for the period when this incident apparently took place was blown overboard by a freak gust of wind while the ship was in harbour. So, if that's the sort of answer that a 5-star military officer gets when he presses for information about what governments know about UFOs, what hope have the rest of us got? Well, before I wrap up, I did, and what I've tried to do, I hope you'll forgive me for having leapt around from subject to subject a bit, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what it was like looking at this subject from within government, and a sense of some of the cases in our files. I'm here tomorrow, and I'm giving a second presentation tomorrow in which I will be going into more detail on the single most compelling case that we ever had, the Rendlesham Forest incident that took place at the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. So I'm going to be doing a whole presentation on that single case tomorrow. You know, so we have those sorts of cases, but so that's why I've been leaping around from subject to subject. But I mentioned those 2 Royal Society discussion meetings, and when I started this presentation, I talked about how the mainstream media this week in the United States was finally beginning to wake up and pay attention and realize that, hey, wait a minute, you know, if this subject was of no interest, how come the American government had 130,000 pages of documents on this? This is not the sort of, you know, amount of material that you have on a subject that's just swamp gas. You know, who would have 130,000 pages of government documents on swamp gas? Wait a minute, something doesn't add up. But it's not just the media who are beginning to pay attention to this. In the United Kingdom in 2010, there were 2 Royal Society discussion meetings. The first one, and this is for people who think that the scientific community doesn't take this seriously. They do, but you know, there are still some issues about speaking too publicly about these sorts of things. But the proceedings of these meetings are out there. They're not classified or anything. The first meeting was called "The Detection of Extraterrestrial Life and the Consequences for Science and Society." And the second one, you know, fantastic title, "Towards a Societal Agenda on Alien Life." This is a scientific meeting. The Royal Society celebrated its 300th anniversary recently. Its previous fellows included Sir Isaac Newton, Einstein, more recently Stephen Hawking. And this is not a college science club. This is arguably the prestige science body maybe anywhere in the world. And yet they're sitting down discussing things like, what would be the impact on world religions if any of this turned out to be true? Oh, great. I don't have time to go into this, but the answer to that question, apparently, is that it would not shatter people's religious faith, it would actually strengthen it, because when people actually went out and discussed this with religious people, what they said was, well, if we find out it's not just us, doesn't it make the glory of God's creation look even bigger and more magnificent than we previously were aware? So far from, you know, you hear these phrases like there's going to be panic in the streets, it's going to shatter people's faith, and actually when you test these assumptions, it's not true. If it was on the front page of the paper tomorrow, government admits UFOs are alien, there's not going to be panic in the streets. There's going to be a whole bunch of people saying, told you so. They've been lying to us for years. So that's why these Royal Society meetings were so interesting. One of the funny things, though, just back on religion, was as a kind of postscript to that, they found out that people all thought that their own particular denomination would be very mature and comfortable and robust with this. But whatever religion they spoke to, they thought they got the answer, well, we'll be fine with it, but some of those other religions would probably just, you know, panic and, you know. So Catholics thought that they could handle it, but the Protestants would freak out. You know, Baptists thought that they would be very welcoming, but maybe the Catholics would panic. Anyway, suffice to say, actually, it turned out everyone thought they would be pretty comfortable with it. A former chief historian of NASA gave an extraordinary presentation in which he said that if we encounter extraterrestrials, he said we're probably largely in what he called the post-biological universe. And then he said, when we encounter other life, he said, we will probably find that what we first interact with will be immortal thinking machines. And I had to kind of say to myself, wait a minute, post-biological universe, immortal thinking machines, and I had to kind of remind myself that I was not at a sci-fi convention, but a really highbrow scientific symposium. So if anyone in the audience thinks that people regard them as being somewhat quirky for being interested in UFOs, you're not quirky at all. You know, some of the finest minds on the planet are interested in this, and quite rightly too. You know, I don't stand here and pretend to have all the answers, but my goodness, I've got some questions. And for anyone that says that UFOs are just a waste of time, and that people that see them are crazy, and people that are interested in them are crazy, I would say this: what question could be bigger and more profound than, are we alone or not in the cosmos? And if we're not, are we being visited? And how, in a sense, small-minded it would be to say that those questions weren't interesting. I think they're the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves. And long may people like you carry on asking those questions and carry on fighting to bring out the truth. Either those of you who've had sightings to say to the media, you know, this isn't just a silly story to be kind of put away on the back page. These things are seen by police officers and military personnel and pilots. These things are tracked on radar. These things do perform speeds and maneuvers that we can't hope to match. And that's not even disputed anymore. You can read it in these files that were released this week. You can read it in the British government's UFO files, now declassified and available at the National Archives in the UK. So, in closing, I would say, you know, UFOs are interesting, they are important. There is one slight kind of word of warning, though. If the day does come when it's announced that we've discovered extraterrestrial life and we're not alone and everything is revealed, if you ask yourselves the question, wow, that's fantastic, does any of this mean I don't have to go to work anymore? Sadly, the answer is, yeah, you do have to go to work. Because life will go on. But one day, life will go on in the post-disclosure and post-detection universe. And I firmly believe that even though I don't have an exact date, and I don't know the way, shape, or form that this is going to unfold, whether it's going to be a landing on the White House lawn, the detection of a signal with a radio telescope, or an announcement, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. That would have been great for the State of the Union. I don't know when it's going to happen, but one day that day will come, and I think it's getting very close. And I firmly believe that this is the generation that will see it, and that those of you sitting in this room will share it, and will be here to experience what will be, arguably, one of the most profound and meaningful and important, in the literal sense of the word, revelations ever to have affected the human race. So, with that thought of what might come, I will leave you and thank you very much indeed for listening to me. I hope it's been of interest. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Good job. Okay, we're gonna have to wipe you now. And the rest of you too. Okay. No, that was a great talk. And you know, he's really a pretty good comedian too. I was really impressed. We're on the Inception Network, and I'd like the world to know that the folks are here in Del Rio. So let's make some noise. Let them hear us around the world.